Fanon. The year was 1969, when a small group of young men formed the Philadelphia branch of the Black Panther Party. I was among them, and being barely 15 was the youngest, but my height and size made me seem older. Being a Panther meant not just long, hard work in the community. It meant spending time studying and reading materials that were not familiar. I remember reading Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, or rather, tried to. It was written for adults, scholars, revolutionaries, or psychologists. It wasn't written for kids who hadn't graduated high school. Yet orders were orders. So I slogged through the English translation published by Grove Press. I can't say I understood much of it, but some things stuck with me and caused me to think not about the conditions of besieged Algerians facing French colonialism and domination, but of the life of black folks here in America. One intriguing segment stuck in my mind. Fanon wrote, "While the settler or the policeman has the right the livelong day to strike the native, to insult him, and to make him crawl to them, you'll see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native. For the last resort of the native is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his brother. It is as if plunging into a fraternal bloodbath allowed them to ignore the obstacle and to put off till later the choice, nevertheless inevitable, which opens up the question of armed resistance to colonialism. Thus, collective auto-destruction in a very concrete form is one of the ways in which the native's muscular tension is set free." When I looked outside the office on Columbia Avenue or out the window of our apartment on Oxford Street, I saw what he described played out as if he were reading my mind. Every Friday or Saturday night, the neighborhood would be in the throes of self-directed violence for the slightest offense. If a brother stepped on another brother's shoe, he could die this weekend. The hospitals did a brisk business in sewing up black folks on the weekend. This I saw, and it gave me tremendous insight into the psychic wounds of oppression, whether one was in the so-called Arab Quarter in Algiers or on Girard Avenue in North Philadelphia. In essence, it was the same thing. I read him then because it was required of us all, and afterwards, in PE or political education classes, we might be called on to discuss and explain our readings, or worse, teach it to people in the community. But truth be told, much of it was Greek to me. Manichaeistic? Pathological? Huh? But the drive to learn is a remarkable thing. So is duty. So you read and read until some things pierce the fog of understanding. Years later, when I reread Fanon, I became intoxicated with his ideas, his analysis, and indeed his predictions of how Africa would emerge from the colonial era into neo-colonialism. Few have performed such a task with Fanon's brilliance or with his acuity of vision. One need only look at passages from The Wretched of the Earth regarding the African bourgeoisie to see how these words, penned over half a century ago, could have been written the very day these words are written. Fanon wrote the following: "The national bourgeoisie, which has totally assimilated colonialist thought in its most corrupt form, takes over from the Europeans and establishes in the continent a racial philosophy which is extremely harmful for the future of Africa. From nationalism, we have passed into ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism." Fanon's insights could be summarized in place names like Rwanda, Sudan, Burundi, Liberia, and Nigeria, just to state a few. Kenyan writer and activist Koigiwa Wamwere likened the vast loss of African life to that of an atom bomb, a weapon of mass destruction, which he called and wrote a book entitled Negative Ethnicity. And the real reason isn't because Hutus hate Tutsis or Luos hate Kikuyu or Zulus hate Swazis. It's because the work of decolonization was never truly completed. According to Wamwere, over 5 million African men, women, and children have died from civil wars and ethnic rivalries since the independence movements of the 60s resulted in so-called independence. Thus, Fanon's warnings, if heeded, could have prevented the deaths of some 5 million people in the last half of the 20th century. But it would be misleading to paint Fanon as some kind of prophet. He was a man active in the freedom movements of millions. He knew, met with, and worked with Congo's Patrice Lumumba, its rightful representative, until the UN-CIA plot to unseat and assassinate him. Lumumba was slain less than a year after the August 1960 meeting of the Pan-African Conference in Leopoldville, where the two men met. Afterwards, Fanon issued a stiff warning to African leaders about the nature of colonialism and the need for such leaders to fight against these alien, destructive influences. In his book, African Revolution, Fanon wrote, "Africa must understand that there will not be one Africa that fights against colonialism and another that attempts to make arrangements with colonialism. Our mistake, the mistake we Africans made, was to have forgotten that the enemy never withdraws sincerely. He never understands. He capitulates, but he does not become converted. Our mistake is to have believed that the enemy has lost his combativeness and his harmfulness. If Lumumba is in the way, Lumumba disappears. Hesitation to murder has never characterized imperialism. Look at Ben Mahidi. Look at Mumia. Look at Lumumba. Our mistake is to have been slightly confused in what we did. It is a fact that in Africa today, traitors exist. They should have been denounced and fought. The fact that this is hard after the magnificent dream of an Africa gathered together unto itself and subject to the same requirements of true independence does not alter facts. Let us be sure never to forget it. The fate of all of us is at stake in the Congo." Frantz Fanon had a profound impact on leaders and members of the Black Panther Party. Indeed, before the BPP was even organized, Bobby Seale loaned his copy of The Wretched of the Earth to Huey P. Newton, who was so intrigued by the work that he read it 6 times. Because Newton was a notoriously slow but deep reader, this gives us some idea of its influence on the man. Kathleen Neal Cleaver, then the party's communications secretary, wrote years later that the first lines of Fanon's book gripped her. Quote, "National liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to a people. Whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon." Frantz Fanon, although he died at an early age, impacted the lives of people all around the world. He, of course, made a tremendous impact with his writings, but beyond those were his professional and political pursuits. He was a doctor, a psychiatrist, and a revolutionary who worked with the FLN in Algeria. In his practice, he not only treated combatants who suffered from torture, but French torturers who often complained of hearing screams in their dreams. His diagnosis? Quit torturing people. He changed treatment regimens for psychiatric patients at Blida Hospital in Algeria, saying that hospitalization should be minimized as the patient should experience as much liberty at home life as possible. He learned Arabic to listen to and speak to his patients so as to protect the doctor-patient confidentiality. He worked as a clandestine cadre for the Front de Libération Nationale, the National Liberation Front, or FLN. He was expelled from Algeria and went to Tunis to become editor of Al Mujahid, the FLN organ, and was appointed director of FLN health clinics. He was named Algerian representative of the provisional government. He was an exemplary revolutionary, a freedom fighter, a thinker, and a humanist. He will be long remembered. I thank you. From death row for La Fondation Fanon, this is Mumia Abu-Jamel.